10.3 has to do with virology. Remember we said that's the study of viruses. We were at the point where we're ready to talk about the word called emerging viruses. And emerging viruses are viruses that have originally started in an animal. In other words, it normally infected an animal, but remember that viruses said that they could mutate, and in the process of mutating have now been able to infect humans. So the disease started in an animal, that was the normal animal remember they're highly specific, and then now, after it has mutated, it is now can be found in like humans. And we'll talk about some examples of that. One is the influenza virus. Flu is one of those that's capable of mutating. There was actually quite a while back, there was I guess you'd say a strain or a variety of flu that was called the bird flu. It was a flu that we think originally just infected birds. It's hard to think of birds having the flu, but birds could have the flu. And then through mutation, it now is able to infect humans. So that particular kind of flu is called the bird flu. It's not all flu is the bird flu, just that particular kind of flu. There was another one, I think it was called swine flu. And we've had different animals that we think we've traced down to where it originated from. Okay? HIV is one that I think maybe the word is still out a little bit on it, but we think HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, started out actually in monkeys. Monkeys originally had HIV. Now, it doesn't mean that in monkeys it produced the same symptoms as it does in humans, but it mutated, and now humans are capable of having being affected by this virus. So these sort of like new viruses that come about through the mutation, in this way, we call those emerging viruses. Doesn't mean they're coming out of something. It's just that they were in one animal, and through mutations has allowed them now to affect a different organism. Particularly, we're interested in affecting us, but I suppose it could happen from one animal maybe to another animal as well. Now, in this southern part of the U.S., we have a virus called the hantavirus that is one of those. It started out in wild rodents, and now it affects humans, and it says this can be quite lethal. In other words, if you get this virus, your survival rate is pretty low unless you get treatment quickly. Now, one that you probably have heard about is West Nile virus. That one is actually carried by what? Mosquitoes, right? It's caused by mosquitoes. It's different than the mosquito that carries malaria. Okay, it's a different kind of mosquito. We don't have their mosquitoes over here, and ours aren't over there either. We have our own kind of. So the mosquitoes that you deal with every day could be carrying West Nile virus. So they've set up traps all over, to trap mosquitoes and test how many of those have HIV. We're always concerned about that spreading into our area. I think last summer there were only a few mosquitoes that they found had that. Now, as far as we know, I don't know that there were either very few or no humans actually got West Nile in our area. Okay, SARS is another one of those that is an emerging virus. SARS stands for severe, acute, respiratory syndrome. In other words, it's going to affect your lungs, particularly. But it's also another emerging virus. So, what do we mean by an infectious disease? Remember, you are doing your report on infectious disease. Maybe I can just stop at the moment. Are there any questions that any of you have about your report and the making of your report? Yes?
How long does it need to be?
I would rather not say, it has to be so many words. I would rather, if you look at the list of questions, if you have answered each question adequately, then it's long enough. Yes?
For the PowerPoint, can you just do like bullet points and like phrases?
Yes. And maybe it wasn't in your class we talked about that. Maybe it's the other section. But you could do bullet points. Here is a way, not necessarily the way, but you could take one of those questions and make it sort of like the title of that slide, and then underneath it you have the bullet points that answers that question. That would work. So your report is due next Tuesday. In other words, a little less than a week now, but you have a weekend in between to work on it some more. And then when we come back from Thanksgiving vacation, then some of you will be presenting yours, okay, kind of at random. So everybody needs to be ready.
Are we just going to give you the flash drive?
Yeah, you'll probably want it to be on a flash drive. It'll make it easy if you have to be chosen to give your presentation. We'll just plug it into my laptop, we'll load it up, and then you give your presentation. Yes?
What if we put a paper? Would we
Now, if you write a paper, you're just going to have to give it, I guess, as a speech, I suppose. Yeah. I think probably the easiest way, it depends on how good you're at PowerPoint. To me, I think, for me, PowerPoint probably the easiest, And the beauty of PowerPoint is you can have pictures. In a report, it's a little harder to when you're giving the report, to be able to show pictures of what you're talking about. Yes, Laura?
could you theoretically do a poster then?
Say that one more time.
Could you theoretically do a poster then? Like, could you do a poster? Since you're talking about like a PowerPoint. I mean, I'm going to do a PowerPoint.
Oh, you mean using Post-its? Is that what you're saying? Or am I totally misunderstanding
Like
your question?
using like an actual poster.
Oh, poster. Boy, again. You could do it as a poster, sure. A little harder to carry around, but but yes, you could do it as a poster. I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. Okay, back to, so the infectious diseases report could be bacteria or viruses. And infectious diseases are diseases that are caused by a virus or some other organism. It doesn't have to be a bacteria necessarily. We have some of them that I've listed are not viruses or bacteria. They're actually caused by one of them we haven't studied yet. So some of you will find out about a name that's not a kind of bacteria or a kind of virus. But it invades the body in some way. And just viruses and bacteria happen to be the main way that people get infected with diseases, but not the only way. Now, there was a guy by the name of Robert Koch. Could also be pronounced Koch. Probably in its original pronunciation was probably pronounced like that. Koch, more with the, like, in German, they kind of clear your throat a little bit when you're going, Some people pronounce it Koch. There's, lots of different pronunciation. One's kind of more of the American English pronunciation. The other one's probably more of the German pronunciation. Anyway, he came up with etymology, or not etymology, etiology. And the other thing about disease detection is like germ theory. Okay, how do diseases spread using germs? Now, germs is just a real generic term. It could be bacteria, could be viruses, could be whatever. that's causing that. Okay? But he's the guy that came up with a method that we still use today in figuring out what causes a disease, especially when we run into something new and we have gone through all the possibilities that could have caused it, and we find out it's not any of those. Well, now we have to figure out, okay, what's the new organism that's causing this? Now, it doesn't mean that it's a new organism that we've never seen before, but we didn't realize there is a kind of that organism that can cause this. So here's his postulate, the way that he looked at that question. How is a disease caused? So first of all, he says, if this organism causes a disease, this suspected pathogen should be only found in people who are sick, but not in people who are healthy. That makes sense? That's kind of logical, right? Whatever's causing it should be only in the people that are sick, not in the people that are healthy. Okay? Then the suspected pathogen, they would have to get some of that. You know, if it was in your lungs, they'd probably take a sample in your lung. If it was in your blood, they'd probably take a sample of your blood. But they would try to culture that suspected pathogen. So we think it's this, and we'll try to grow it so we have a lot more of those germs. I'm going to use the word germs kind of loosely here. Pathogen. Then we're going to take some of this cultured pathogen, germ, and we're going to inject it into someone who's healthy. If I'm right, what should happen? Yeah, that healthy person should get sick. That healthy person should get sick. Now, to kind of seal the whole thing, you kind of would have to do the next step. Okay, now we would sample the originally healthy person who got sick and try to extract out this pathogen and check, is this pathogen the same one that I infected the healthy person with? If it is, I now have identified what pathogen causes that person to be sick. So I start out with the original assumption, if this is true, only the sick people should have this pathogen, not the healthy people. I try to isolate that pathogen and culture it so I have a lot of it, so I can make it into an injection to give to somebody who's healthy. If the healthy person gets sick, then I try to extract some of that out of that newly infected person and check it with my original pathogen. If it is the same, I've now determined what is the actual cause of that disease. I'm going to take just a moment to explain something that has happened more recently. I don't know, it's probably not before your lifetime, but I mean, it was during my lifetime. It was commonly thought, in fact, many doctors thought this, that stomach ulcers were caused by stress and diet. In other words, maybe ate too many spicy foods, or you just had a lot of stress and a lot of stomach acid and stuff like that would cause stomach ulcers. Well, there was a doctor in Australia that came across some information. I don't know if he had tested some things out, that he was pretty sure that stomach ulcers were actually caused by a certain kind of bacteria that I can't remember the name of right now, but it's a name that has, in Latin, has to do with the stomach and things like that. And so he was going to offer this information for all doctors to benefit from his. Now, how do you typically treat bacteria, a bacterial infection? We usually use what? Starts with an A. Okay, use an antibiotic, okay? So then these doctors could then give an antibiotic, and this person should get over the stomach ulcers. His friends told him that it wasn't a smart idea. In fact, the medical community, the doctors, just basically made fun of him and ridiculed him. Everybody knows it's caused by stress and diet, you know? So he doesn't have anybody believing him. So in other words, he suspected that people who had stomach ulcers had something in them that people without stomach ulcers didn't have. And so he was able to extract out of the stomach the bacteria that he was sure was causing stomach ulcers. Now, the next step is he has to infect a healthy person. Well, stomach ulcers is not something that you want, at least the way people viewed it at that time, is kind of like something you might have to deal with the rest of your life. So who would want to be infected by something that could potentially make me sick for the rest of my life? You know, I might be better some, but I'd never be well. And so he's, okay, if nobody's going to do it, then I'll just infect myself. Well, so before he infected himself, he has to first verify that he is that healthy person. So he went to some of his friends who were doctors, and they did tests on him to verify that his stomach was totally healthy. Then he mixed up this and drank some of this bacteria that caused stomach ulcers. And he got this really bad case of stomach ulcers. Well, you have to be sure that that's really what you have, right? Because you can't just say that I have it. So he went to the doctors and tested it out, and sure enough, he had a really bad case of stomach ulcers. Well, if that really is the organism that causes it, then I should be able to give this antibiotic, and I should get well. So he then gave himself injections of the antibiotic that would help him, and in a matter of time, he was totally healthy again. Well, you still have to verify that you are in fact healthy. So then he went and had it tested that, sure enough, you're all healthy again. So he's the first guy who uses kind of it's a variation of this, but much the same idea, that stomach ulcers are not caused by stress and diet. They only make it worse. But they aren't the cause of it, and it's a bacteria, and all you have to do is take an antibiotic, and that kills that, or gets rid of that bacteria in your stomach, and then you'll be healthy. And so he then is given credit for having figured out what caused stomach ulcers, which has been around for thousands of years, but nobody knows. He's the first person to figure it out, but he uses that method. Okay, now here's a word that we use when you are going to do your report. One is the incubation period. That's the time between the time you get infected until the symptoms start to appear. Bacterial infections kind of start up a little more slowly. Viruses tend to come on you a little quicker. We talked about how quickly they multiply. Now, if you get these pathogens into your body, what effect do they have? Well, some of them will begin destroying tissue in your body. Some of them will attack your lungs. Some of them could, like the bacteria that cause stomach ulcers actually eat holes into the lining of your stomach, things like that. Some of the bacteria do their harm not by damaging tissue directly, but by producing poisons. Now, these poisons probably are nothing more than waste products that, every organism has to give off waste products. This happens to be one that if we are exposed to those waste products, they affect us like poisons do. Tuberculosis is one of the infectious diseases that in the U.S. there were a lot of people that had tuberculosis. My dad's generation was one where there were a lot of people that had TB. They would actually have special hospitals for people that had tuberculosis. We're kind of at the point now where, you know, the number of people that get TB in the U.S. is so small that we aren't even concerned about it. You know, we just deal with it. But there are other countries where TB is probably a lot more common. They don't have the health system or the sanitary systems maybe that we have here. I remember that when I was, I think one of the early years of my teaching career, they were still testing people for TB. Well, actually, it wasn't that terribly long ago either. They were testing teachers. So I think there's certain parts of the country maybe it was more common. And this little thing, they took it out of this wrapper, and it was probably about the size of maybe a postage stamp. And out of one end were 4 needles that stuck out, not very long, but maybe about that long. And they'd put it on your arm, and then they would press it into your arm, and it would poke holes in your arm. And I'm not sure what it was on these needles, but you'd become potentially infected. If you had TB, then if you'd had TB, your body would have produced an agent that will help you defend it off in the future. And so if it got red around these pin pokes, then that was to be concerned. Now, when they did mine, I didn't have it. My dad, I don't know if he had that test or something else, but they determined that sometime when he was younger, he had TB. I know how it was. He had to have some test where they did an x-ray of his lungs and found out he had scar tissue on his lungs, very typical of somebody who'd had TB. So my dad probably had tuberculosis when he was younger, but maybe a mild enough case that he didn't even remember having had it. He probably just thought it was like a cold or something like that, because you cough and stuff like that. Okay? It's spread by inhalation, so in other words, if you cough into the air, people breathing in that same air can become infected as well. So they would often take people who had this and put them away from other people so that they wouldn't infect other people. Okay? But it does attack your lung tissue. And the reason why it's called tuberculosis is because it forms clumps of tissue that are called tuberculose. And like molecules, but tubercules. What are some other symptoms of tuberculosis? Well, fatigue. But that's not the only infectious disease that forms fatigue, right? If you have flu, you get tired, right? And achy. Except this one has a persistent cough that it just keeps going on and on and off. After most people get over the cold, in a week, they're still coughing for a long time after that. So that if you need to stand up, you can to stay awake. So now we said that some of them attack tissues, but some of them actually produce poisons. There's 2 kinds of poisons that they produce. One is an exotoxin. Exo means what? Outside, right? And endo means inside. Okay, so kind of remember that, how this fits into the definition. Okay, an exotoxin is going to be one that diffuses from a living cell into the surrounding tissue. So in other words, this living cell has could be the pathogen making these poisons, and it secretes these outside and then affects the surrounding tissue. And it says the cause of symptoms of most infectious diseases is this kind. Okay, you have a living cell that's producing chemicals that are making the surrounding tissues and harming them. Diphtheria was a disease that was, common, way more common in the past than it is now anymore, because a lot of people are just vaccinated for that anymore, so we don't, most people don't have it. The only concern that we have, in our country, you don't have to be vaccinated, but if any of these diseases that we think we have eradicated start coming back, guess who are the ones that are going to be getting these? The ones that weren't vaccinated for that particular disease. And so it could spread quickly through that population of those that weren't vaccinated. Now, one of the reasons that people give for not vaccinating is that they think that some of the things like autism and some of these others are actually caused by some of the things in the vaccines. Well, they have done many tests to check that out and have yet to come up with any real proof that that's what's happening. So there's got to be some other, maybe environmental factor that's causing that, not the vaccine. Just because there are a lot of people that are vaccinated that don't have these symptoms. And so you have to take Koch's postulate and kind of work through it. Well, if there are people that got the vaccine and didn't get sick, then it's probably not caused by that. So this is one that produces an exotoxin, and it affects the respiratory system. So people who had diphtheria, it affected their respiratory system. They had a sore throat, and if you would look at their back of their throat, quite sometimes if you've ever been at the doctor when you've been sick, the doctor sticks this little tongue depressor in your tongue to push it down so they can make a good look at your throat. Okay, so some of these diseases are affecting your throat. Remember, this is affecting the respiratory system, which starts, up in your nose and all the way down into your lungs. So along the way, and these happen to be covered with leathery, bluish, white membrane that covers the surface instead of night being reddish colored or pinkish colored. You see this over that as well. And this will block areas for oxygen to get to and ultimately can cause people to suffocate to death. Okay? So it's not, that's one of the reasons why we don't want anybody to get this disease. So we have in the past vaccinated for these so that no one will get those. Now, endotoxins, we said, were inside. So these would remain inside the pathogen as part of its structure, and they don't cause any problems until the pathogen dies. And when the pathogen dies and breaks open, then these poisons that were all just totally enclosed inside the pathogen are now open and they can start affecting the body. So when the pathogen dies, that's when you get affected by that particular kind of poison. Botulism is a bacterial infection that you can get. We often call it food poisoning, but it's an exotoxin, and it's produced by bacteria in improperly canned or prepared food. Canning was a common thing. So when you would, let's say you were going to can, let's say some vegetables, you would bring it up to a boiling, and you'd boil it for so and so long so that any bacteria that would be in the container of vegetables would die from the heat, right? And then you would usually put a little special lid on it that had a seal on it and a little band over the top to keep it in place. And then as it would cool, the pressure would drop on the inside of the jar. Usually it was a jar, ball jar, curd jar, or the come of the brands that they were. And the lid would get sucked in, and it would make this popping sound when it would get popped, when it go in. And kind of like that, it's similar to the sound. Have you had some glass drink bottles that have a metal lid on the top of it, and when you open it, it makes that popping sound? Well, this would be the popping sound in the reverse. And so this lid is sucked down like that. Now, if you found one of those containers of canned food and the lid was not sucked in, that means it probably wasn't sealed properly, which means that it could be contaminated and could have botulism growing inside of it. So that food was typically just destroyed. Nobody's going to eat that because you could probably get sick and some people might die. So it's not worth even taking a chance. Yeah, if you found even canned goods today and you found one that was swelled up, I wouldn't eat that stuff. There's something wrong with that. Okay? So it usually spreads with improperly canned food. But that's the way, when I grew up, my parents, well, most families were canning their own food, to take it during the winter months. This was a process that people did for a long time before there even were refrigerators. But it is a nerve toxin. It can affect your nervous system, like paralyzing you. Now, there's another word that we use when we talk about infectious diseases, are communicable diseases. These are the diseases that can spread from one person to another by direct or indirect contact. And we'll talk about the difference between direct contact or indirect contact. Here was one disease that is in our past that we don't have today, but was scarlet fever. It was a disease that when it was considered quite contagious, so contagious that if a person in a house had scarlet fever, the health department would put a sticker on there, and it made it illegal for anybody to go in that house or people in that house to go out, basically, because we don't want anybody else in the population to be infected, because it communicated, it spread from one person to the next. So we need to keep those people out of contact from healthy people. We don't want to infect them. So how do diseases typically get spread? One is they're airborne. So by coughing and sneezing are going to be the main ways that these germs, these pathogens, can be carried on little particles of, when you sneeze, the little tiny water droplets can carry these pathogens, and you can breathe in that air, and the little droplet might evaporate, but these little organisms are kind of floating around in the air for a little while, and you could inhale those. Okay? So coughing and sneezing, so that's the reason why now if you have to cough, they want you to do what? You cough into your arm. Why don't they want you to cough into your hand?
Could you use your hands on stuff so you don't spread it?
Yeah, usually you touch everything with your hands, right? And so there's nothing wrong with coughing into your hand, but what the first thing you should do as soon as that's done is what? Wash your hands before you touch anything else, But if there's no one else in the room, now if there's people in the room, you need to be coughing like this, not too many people go around touching things with their elbows, so you're probably okay. But yeah, wash your hands. When it says wash your hands in the restroom, does that mean just running it under water is good enough? Not at all. you may take some of the germs off, but you leave about as many on there still, so it's that you need to wash soap and water so that the germs are no longer sticking to your skin. Water doesn't knock them off your skin. Well, a few, but not a lot, not enough, yes.
Does drying your hands after you wash help get rid of it?
Yeah, we do know that the paper towel does help rub some of them off, but, we usually don't rub in between our fingers, or if you have rings on, you don't dry off underneath your rings and stuff like that. So, so that's the reason why doctors, before they go into surgery, they spend a long time washing their hands, and with some pretty harsh bacteria soaps and bactericides. They want to try to kill absolutely everything. Are they going to touch the person with their bare hands? No, they're going to still put gloves on top of it, to protect them, but they're trying to reduce the likelihood of them infecting whoever they're operating on in every way possible. Now, direct contact, that's where you touch a sore on the skin or mucous membrane. Where would you find your mucous membrane? Like, yeah, in your nose, right. Picking your nose. And now, little kids are really bad at that, aren't they? What do they do after they pick their nose? If they don't do this, they do something else, but, okay? They're always wiping it off on everything, right? So that's different, usually different about working with this age group. I don't usually find you picking your nose and wiping it on the table or on the chair or things like that, You will go get a tissue and you'll wipe your off. Now your finger still is infected, but at least you haven't left. The little kids do eat them. That's true. And I have seen some adults actually do that. A little surprising. When that happened, pulled up beside this at a stoplight, and there was a lady in the next car, and she was really pretty. It's probably one of the prettiest women I'd seen in a long time. And then out of the corner of my eyes, she was moving, and I looked over there, and there she was. She was just taking her finger and just reaming out her nose. Okay, so that's one strike against her. But the big strike was what? Stuck it in her mouth and ate it. So it's kind of surprising what people do when they think no one's looking, So, yeah, it was a total surprise to me. I thought, oh my goodness. Okay, then we have that's direct contact, where you actually touch the infected thing. Indirect contact is where you're touching something that got contaminated. This would be like drinking out of somebody else's water bottle that has contaminated the water bottle because they're sick with something. When I taught at Kansas City Christian, there was one particular year in the basketball team, I think it was already into January in the basketball season, and there was one game apparently where the game was really close, and everybody's really playing really hard, and it was in the fourth quarter, I think it was, and they called a timeout, and everybody runs over there, and each girl had her own water bottle. I mean, they all looked alike, but they all owned water bottle, and so everybody takes their drink, goes and plays the game, and within a week, I think it was 10 out of the 13 girls had mono. One girl on the team had mono, probably didn't still exhibit the symptoms, the classic symptoms of mono, and she managed to infect everybody else because her drink bottle was contaminated. So that's touching something else that's contaminated by another person. In other words, you aren't contaminated, you can't contaminate yourself, usually. I guess there is a way you can touch something that is contaminated and then bring it to your mouth, and then contaminate your own yourself, I guess. That's this indirect method here. But you're touching something typically.